All right, I have with me again Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine, to give us insight and information on what's really going on in the Russia-Ukraine war. Scott, thank you so much for joining today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so a lot has happened, and I'm sure it's a lot for you to keep up with, but you do an excellent job, and my viewers appreciate your insight. As of today, Poland became the first NATO nation to offer up fighter jets to Ukraine. At the same time, the US Pentagon is saying the United States will not be sending fighter jets. What's your thoughts on why we're not sending fighter jets, and will these jets be able to help Ukraine? What would be the advantage of these jets?
Well, I believe the jets that Poland is providing are MiG-29 fighters. That's a Soviet era fighter that the Polish Air Force acquired back when they were part of the Warsaw Pact. So these are planes that are 30 plus years old. They're old airframes. They may have been upgraded to some extent with Western avionics, which is problematic, and I'll get into that in a second for the Ukrainians. And are they equipped to fire Soviet air-to-air missiles, Soviet air-to-ground munitions, or are they been configured to fire NATO equipment? And this is why, even though the airframes are 30 years old, airplanes can last that long, but air-to-air missiles can't. And so if they had Soviet era air-to-air missiles from stockpiles dating back to the 1980s, these missiles would not be functional today. So my guess is that they've been upgraded to handle the NATO weaponry, which means it's a different avionic system. And if you're a Ukrainian pilot who's been flying Soviet era fighters with Soviet era missiles, it's going to be a different system. But that's getting into the weeds. There's only 4 of these aircraft. That's not a game changer. The fact is, it's not going to have any meaningful impact at all. The Ukrainians are when they put their airplanes up in the air, they tend to get shot down at a very high rate. And I don't think that these aircraft, there's not enough of them to have a meaningful impact on the battlefield. All they're doing is providing more targets for the Russians. And I believe that, unfortunately, for the Ukrainians, these aircraft and the pilots in them are going to have a very short life expectancy. Now, the United States is under pressure to provide the F-16 fighter, which is, of course, an American fighter that, for some reason, people think are some sort of miracle technology. The F-16, like the MiG-29, is old technology. And yes, there are upgraded versions of the F-16 that could be provided, but we're probably not going to provide them because the Ukrainian pilots, again, are trained on the MiG. And anybody here who's an athlete will understand what I'm about to say. Muscle memory. When you train to do something, it's muscle memory. You condition yourself to do the same thing over and over and over again, a repeatable exercise, so that it becomes second nature. Second nature. A football player, a basketball player, a baseball player doesn't have to think through what they're doing because they've practiced it, and it's second nature. This is the same thing with fighter pilots and military professionals. Whether you're an infantryman doing close quarter combat, you are trained. It's repetitive motion so that when the world starts exploding, you do the same thing. You don't hesitate. The same thing with a pilot. You are trained in a specific airframe with specific avionics, with specific performance characteristics, and it's second nature for you. So a Ukrainian pilot who has extensive experience in a MiG fighter or a Sukhoi fighter, these Soviet era fighters, if you're going to try and transition him to a F-16 fighter, it's a completely different airframe, completely different avionics, completely different system. And your muscle memory of the MiG is going to interfere with your ability to properly absorb it. This isn't me saying this. This is the experience of a South Carolina Air National Guard unit that does this kind of transition training for former Soviet client states who have now become NATO members. Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, nations that had MiG fighters who are acquiring American fighters, F-16s. There's a 6-month training program where you transition MiG pilots into F-16 pilots. And what the Air National Guard says is that if you have an experienced MiG pilot, he's actually a very bad F-16 pilot because of the muscle memory issues. When push comes to shove and he's put under stress, he falls back on that which he knows and is comfortable with, and he makes mistakes. He's slower. The pilots that do best are guys with little or no experience in flying a MiG, so they can be solely focused on flying the F-16. And so this is a problem because, the United States, if we're going to provide the F-16, if the best Ukrainian pilots come over, we're actually going to make them worse. They're better off flying the Polish MiG-29s than they are flying American F-16s. The other thing is the F-16 is not capable of the kind of operations that the Ukrainians require. The F-16 has to fly from an improved airfield, an airfield that has good runway systems, good logistical. It's a very maintenance intensive aircraft. The Ukrainians are flying from unimproved airfields. Now the MiG-29 can do that. It's designed to do that. It's a more robust, undercarriage, et cetera. The F-16 can't. There's very few places in Ukraine that it could fly from. Those places are easily identified and targeted by the Russians. To provide the F-16s to the Ukrainians would cost a lot of money, take a lot of effort, and there's that old saying, the squeeze ain't worth the juice. All the effort we're putting in, you're not going to get enough out of it. So the United States has made the right decision not to provide aircraft, which on paper would look like you're upgrading the performance of the Ukrainian Air Force, but in reality, you're degrading it. They're better off getting aircraft that they are comfortable with, they know they can handle. Ukrainians are never going to get enough aircraft to challenge the Russian Air Force in a one-on-one air supremacy battle. The best they're going to be able to do is have aircraft that can harass the Russians, that can harass their troops, that can carry out limited operations. And right now they're doing that with their existing, although severely diminished, Soviet-era air fleet. The MiG-29s, the Sukhoi 27s, the Sukhoi 25s. These are the airframes that the Ukrainians need. They have pilots that can operate them. They have a system, logistics system that can maintain them. And they are able to do the kind of operations that are realistic. To think you're going to come in with a number of American F-16 airframes and dramatically change the nature of this air battle is naive in the extreme.
Okay. So on the one hand, the United States is smart in that they're thinking through this stuff. On the other hand, unless we're giving them a massive amount of air support, it's just not going to change the trajectory of the war.
Correct.
Okay. Yesterday, General Milley and Lloyd Austin of the Pentagon held a joint briefing. In there, Lloyd Austin said something that was very confusing to me. And well, yes and no. Okay, this is what he said. He said that Ukraine will be victorious because 50 nations are supporting her, and Russia will not be victorious because only 2 nations, North Korea and Iran, are supporting them. Are they really believing that this war is going to end depending on how many people are giving you or selling you weapons? That seems so naive to me.
No, you're 100% correct. I mean, the fact of the matter is, this war isn't just a military struggle on the battlefield. This war has an economic aspect to it and a geopolitical aspect to it, a diplomatic aspect to it. The majority of the world does not support what the United States is doing against Russia right now. The majority of the world is either neutral or leaning towards Russia. And that's important when we talk about the economic aspects. You see, one of the major pillars of the American policy approach towards Russia and this conflict with Ukraine was to sanction Russia, thereby undermining their economy, collapsing their economy, creating political pressure on the Russian president. There are some people who have been honest about this. It's called regime change. We saw Kenneth Rogoff, the Harvard professor, member of the G30 banking group, speak at the World Economic Forum in January, I believe, or maybe even February, where he said straight up, sanctions are designed for regime change. And we have the Canadian foreign minister who's come out and basically said the same thing, that we're seeking regime change in Russia using sanctions. But if you talk to Angus King, the independent senator from the state of Maine, he just held a hearing. And Angus King is a big fan of sanctions. He's been promoting sanctions against Russia from day one. But he just held a hearing where he had to say it didn't work, it backfired. And he wants to know why that happened. Why were we promoting a policy that failed across the board, didn't succeed? Russia's economy is stronger now than it was when this war started. The Chinese economy has been reconfigured in a way to not only assist the Russian economic survival in this time of sanctions, but thrive. India is taking Russian energy and doing well on that. The Russians have not been isolated. I don't mean to be facetious, but when was the last time a Russian bank failed? And we can answer that question. When was the last time an American bank failed? So it's not the Russian economy that's having problems. Their economy was supposed to be contracting 25%. It contracted 2% in 2022. In 2023, it's expected to grow. And people should reflect on that. The Russian economy is going to grow despite the fact the United States and the entire collective West are sanctioning that economy, and it's a war economy. War economies don't grow. War economies go into deficit spending mode. The Russians are running a budget surplus, which tells you they're doing something right. The sanctions have failed. So Lloyd Austin is completely wrong when he starts throwing out numbers, because the numbers are meaningless. Now we come to the military equipment aspect of it. Nothing Lloyd Austin talks about is going to change the equation that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, brought up in January, where he honestly said Ukraine is going to run out of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition in the summer, and there's nothing that can be done to change that equation. There's no miracle cure. There's no magic wand. There's nothing that can be done. They're going to run out of ammunition. How does 50 nations equate into Ukraine running out of ammunition if it was functioning the way that Lloyd Austin is insinuating it is? The bottom line is, don't talk about the numbers of nations providing, talk about the quality of the assistance. And the fact of the matter is that quality isn't enough. They're running out of ammunition. The United States has provided $115 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine, most of that in terms of financial assistance, but tens of billions of it in terms of military assistance. And yet the Pentagon has just put forward a budget a requirement down the road that says in order to replace the tens of billions of dollars of equipment that we provide Ukrainians, the Pentagon needs $300 billion. That's a losing economic equation. I mean, I might be a simple Marine and I'm not an economist, but I don't believe that any equation that has you expending tens of billions of dollars and then requiring $300 billion to make up for that has a trajectory that has you going in the right direction. And the United States isn't unique in this. Germany has pretty much acknowledged they've given away everything to Ukraine. They have nothing left. They have troops coming in. They have no helmets for these troops. They have no body armor for these troops. They have no guns for these troops. They have no ammunition for these troops because everything's been given away to Ukraine, and the Germans cannot afford to acquire the equipment necessary to replace it because prices have gone up. They can't build new tanks because the cost of steel is too high, and yet they're giving away the tanks to Ukraine, but not in enough numbers. It's like the MiG. The tanks that are being provided are insufficient quantity. I think the Spaniards right now are in the process of finalizing, preparing 10 tanks to be transferred to Ukraine. But 6 of those 10 tanks are in a depot being brought back into service, meaning that they were broken, they were run down, they couldn't operate. So we're giving Ukraine broken tanks that are decades old. We can fix them, but they're going to break again, and Ukraine doesn't have the means to repair them. That's why the 50 is a meaningless number. When they're putting that number out there, it has no gravitas. It's not a serious number. The reality is, the actual quality and quantity of the equipment being provided to Ukraine, and it's insufficient to the task. The Russian defense industry, on the other hand, is cranking up. And here's the sort of the misleading thing. There's no evidence that North Korea is providing Russia with military assistance, none whatsoever. It's an allegation that's put out by the United States, basically for political purposes. But if you think about it, logically speaking, this is an artillery-driven war, and we've heard from the Jens Stoltenberg that Ukraine's going to run out of artillery. That's a game changer. That's game ender there. When they run out of artillery, the war literally is over at that point in time. Russia uses a lot of artillery ammunition. Now, I'm somebody who believes in studying this problem that Russia's defense industry has been mobilized, and they are producing an awful lot of artillery rounds. One of the numbers that has been put out there is around 420,000 rounds per month. Um, that's a lot of artillery. They need that. That's the fuel for their war engine. Think about that. Think of the Russian artillery as the war engine. The shells are the fuel. So they need 420,000 rounds to keep this thing going. If that was an insufficient number and Russia's getting ready to launch a major offensive, that means they need more artillery. If they're going to acquire that from North Korea, that means the people who control Russia's fate are the North Koreans, because that's the fuel. Imagine being a race car driver and coming into a pit stop and not being in control of your fuel supply. And so you're pitting thinking, I'm going to get fuel. Now, if your team has the fuel, you can be confident you're going to have the fuel. But if you've delegated this to another team and you pull into a pit stop that the other team doesn't provide the fuel, you lose the race. Russia will never delegate the fuel to its war engine to a third party, whether it be North Korea, whether it be China. Now, on Iran, it's not that Russia has delegated anything. Russia has bought a specific weapon system from the Iranians, a drone system that helped Russia upgrade its own drone fleet. But while this has provided a qualitative advantage for Russia in certain aspects of the conflict, it's not one that Russia has to have to win. It's a nice to have, not a need to have. So the implication that somehow Iran is underwriting the Russian war effort just shows a level of ignorance about the sophistication of the Russian defense industry and of the Russian military. And I think it was irresponsible for both Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley to make such insinuations, because it creates a false impression.
And maybe that's what they want. They just want the impression of the United States looking generous, but not having to actually fulfill. Kind of like, hey, we're going to give you 31 tanks, but we can't get them, until 2024. Hey, at least they had good intentions and tried, right? So, okay, going back to Mark Milley, he said in that same conference that Russia, their military is making mindless moves with vast numbers of untrained soldiers. There could be some truth to that, but it does seem that Russia has become significantly more organized in the last 90 to 120 days. Is he using old intel, or is there some truth to what he's saying?
No, there's no truth to what he's saying. It's not even that he's using old intel. What's happening right now, and it's happening across the board, is what I call mirror imaging, meaning that Ukraine is right now in a state of imminent collapse. Their military is becoming virtually dysfunctional, and one of the reasons is they're running out of manpower. So Ukraine is going around and literally kidnapping people off the streets, including 14 and 16-year-old boys who are showing up on the front line with 3 days of training. So they're kidnapped from the streets of Odessa, given 3 days of training. They end up in Bakhmut and they die. This is happening in massive numbers. And this is a public relations problem for the Ukrainians. So what we're doing is we're mirror imaging the problems of Ukraine onto the Russians. But the Russians aren't doing that. The Russians mobilized 300,000 men in September. The vast majority of those men are still undergoing training. So the notion that these are poorly trained troops is just absurd in the extreme. These were military reservists who already had served in the military, had a modicum of experience, and instead of being thrown straight into the fight, they're being sent to a training area where for now, September, October, November, December, January, February, we're coming up on 7 months of training to get them ready to perform on the battlefield. So Mark Milley is just making this up. It's not what's happening. The Russians are extraordinarily well equipped. They have modern equipment, modern tanks, modern artillery. They have body armor. They have everything they need, and they're trained to do this job. These are not poorly trained troops, and they're not throwing them in human wave assaults. The fact of the matter is that the casualty ratio right now is insane. Normally in a war, the offense versus defense is you want a 3-to-1 advantage from the offense to defense, because generally speaking, you're going to take more casualties than a defender. So you need that kind of advantage. The Russians right now are operating with parity in numbers when it comes to infantry, but superiority in numbers when artillery. But on the casualty ratio, they're killing Ukrainians sometimes as high as 16 to 1 in a day. Sometimes it drops down to 10, sometimes it drops down to 8. But what that means is if you on the best day the Ukrainians are having, for every 800 Ukrainians that die, they're killing 100 Russians. But on the worst day, for every 100 Russians that die, 1,600 Ukrainians die. And the Ukrainians are having a lot of bad days, not so many good days, but even their good day is a nightmare. It's Ukraine that's chewing through its troops at a rate that's unimaginable. And I think it was Lloyd Austin that threw out a number, casualty number of 100,000. I think in the same presentation, he talked about 100,000 dead. But he knows that's a lie. He knows that he was reported to by General Zaluzhny, of the Ukrainian army last month, that Ukraine had suffered close to 250,000 dead, on top of which there are 83,000 missing, most of whom are dead, which means that Ukraine has suffered around 320,000 dead. That's the honest number. But Lloyd Austin can't be honest about that because that's a number that just boggles the mind. If you look at the combatant losses of the United States in World War II, in both the Pacific Front and the European Front, we didn't lose 320,000 dead. We lost fewer than that in terms of combatant deaths, people who died in combat. The Ukrainians have lost 320,000 combatant deaths in 1 year. That's a ridiculous number. That's a sickening number. And it reflects the reality of what's going on the ground in Ukraine today. And Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley can't be honest about that, because if they were, American people would say, then we need to bring this war to an end, because this is just resulting in the death of people that we claim to be supporting.
Yeah, I spoke recently with Colonel Macgregor, and he said that the United States, this is a humanitarian crisis now, and that they owe it to Eastern Europe to switch